Ladies and gentlemen, we have a real serious problem. There was a study that was recently conducted by Gallup, and what the study said was that when individuals feel that they can't find people who think like them politically or any type of ideology, what they do is segregate themselves and isolate themselves from others. And that's a problem because in a time where there's increasingly more division, we really need each other more than ever before. And so I want to tell you a little bit about why proximity and why presence is so important in terms of building relationships. And I want to start with telling you my own personal story. So I grew up in Shreveport, Louisiana. For many people, I hear some folks who give love. Shreveport, for many of you in Dallas, would call it East Texas. The reality is that it is actually a part of the state of Louisiana. And Shreveport is a city that is more than 50% African American. The state of Louisiana is one of the highest. It's the second in the country with the largest African American population. And as a kid growing up, even though I saw all these people who looked like me, segregation was really apparent. There were certain parts of the community that I remember growing up in that you may not have wanted to go to at certain times because you didn't look like the community. And so I noticed for my family that the way that they dealt with that was through their own faith. And so I want to pull up this picture of my grandparents. My grandparents were amazing. You can tell they're gorgeous people too. And my grandfather fought for this country. And as a black man and fighting for freedom, couldn't really experience that freedom for himself. And so he ended up moving into a community called Cedar Grove with my grandmother. And my grandmother was one of the wisest people that I've ever known. She only went up to a 6th grade education. Loved Jerry Springer while she was alive, I must say that. But she was one of the most brilliant people that I ever knew. And what I learned from them was the impact of community, because they took me to church. And I saw them as my grandfather as a deacon and my grandmother in the choir. And church was a way where they were able to have a sense of freedom and community. But this was the thing that was so interesting. At church, I saw people who looked like me, who were landscapers and teachers and folks who just wanted the best for their families. They had 5 children, my dad being the second oldest. And my dad and my mother is here today. My dad and my mother were high school sweethearts, and they went to college together, went to Paul Quinn College, which at that time was in Waco, Texas. And my dad graduated from Paul Quinn in 1970 as Mr. Paul Quinn College. My mother did not graduate from college and went back home to take care of her elderly mother. But my dad, upon graduating, had a degree in physical education, and he could not find a job that paid enough money to take care of his family. So instead, he decided to wait tables. So my dad met a man by the name of Abe Rittman, who was so known in Shreveport for having a restaurant called Abe's Seafood and Steakhouse. And Mr. Rittman not only gave my dad a job, he actually changed his trajectory. Mr. Rittman opened up the door to his restaurant, but taught my dad how to open up his own business. And in the 80s, this 6'6" black man opened a restaurant that had a full bar, had a jazz band on weekends, and I got a chance in that space to see some amazing people come through. I saw athletes and actors and politicians and all these different people who didn't always look like me, who were coming to this space who felt safe, who enjoyed great food around music and some adult beverages as well. I went to a high school that was called Caddo Magnet High School in Shreveport, and this is the thing that's so interesting. I mentioned to you that my city was more than 50% African American, but my high school was not. My high school was a place in which my graduating class, there were 269 of us who graduated, and a little over 70 of us were African American. In a community that was completely African American, but those students were bussed out so that we could come into their school, their former school, and be a part of this new pilot program of looking at magnet schools for students. And in that space, I got a chance to see folks who had enormous wealth. I had classmates who drove Jaguars, who drove Saabs, I'm not kidding, in 9th grade. I saw people who had homes behind their parents' homes that they lived in high school. And that opportunity exposed me to so many different ways of living and different experiences. And then I left and went to UT Arlington. UTA was such a different experience for me because there, not only did I just see black and white as I had experienced at home, my whole world changed. My roommate was very wealthy from Connecticut. My other roommate was from El Paso. I had all of these different experiences, and as you're noticing, there are these relationships that began to develop in my life that gave me great exposure and expanded my network. I then had the opportunity to work at the University Outreach Center in Dallas with an amazing Latina by the name of Michelle Bobadilla, who to this day is still a mentor and dear friend of mine. And Michelle saw me volunteering. I was teaching a diversity class on weekends, and in retrospect, they should have never allowed me to teach that class because those poor kids now are probably really messed up. But I thought I was teaching them something amazing, and Michelle Bobadilla was watching me. And she opened up the door for me at 21 years old to get an assistant director position with Texas A&M University in their outreach center here in Dallas, working with first-generation college students or potential college students. And that was another amazing experience. After a year, I left and moved to Oklahoma City because I realized I needed a little bit more education to pursue some things I wanted to do. And so at Oklahoma City, what was very interesting there was I was now not just a black female, I was American. Because Oklahoma City University at that time recruited students who were from other countries heavily, and a lot more than they did recruit American students. So in this space, I had folks who were becoming my friend because I could speak English. And it totally changed my trajectory of having friends who were from Iraq and from all these different places around the world. And then the culminating experience for me was going to India. And so I had a chance as a part of a documentary called Friendly Captivity, where 7 of us from Dallas actually went to India to understand that as much as we thought folks were in captivity and had issues there, we had a lot more issues here than we realized. And what was amazing in that experience is that I had women who walked up to me and pulled up their sleeves and said, same, same. These women were Dalits, the untouchables, and they had an experience similar to what people of color all over the world have in dealing with colorism. And in that moment, I recognized that color is an issue that not just it happens here in the U.S., it is a global issue that we're wrestling with and still haven't been able to deal with and decipher. And all of those experiences have been so impactful on the woman that I became because with each of those, you see this portrait that's been created, a web of relationships. And at that time, I didn't realize what I was building. I realized that I was building something called social capital. Social capital, I'll be very honest, my dissertation research is around this term, but my issue with it is that we have to be careful with thinking that relationships are only transactional because they're not. Relationships can be that way, but we also have to begin to start thinking about relationships as being transformational. And so social capital is this big term that really means networks, associations, relationships. There is a guy in the early 1900s who saw some people talking. His name was Hannafin, and he coined the term and said, that's social capital. People are connecting and making relationships. And this is the thing about social capital. It's important, but it does not work unless there's trust. If we do not have trust, it is the glue to build our networks and our relationships. And so social capital is important because it impacts our education, it impacts our employment, our income, our opportunities. And so when you have people who are isolated and segregated based on their education, they're resharing the same information. And so we have to be very mindful about there's nothing wrong with connecting to people that are like us. And one of the forms of social capital, which is called bonding, there's nothing wrong with connecting to people like us, but at some point we have to be very intentional about thinking about connecting to people that are different, not just by race, but by thought, by religion, by gender, by all those things that we consider as different. And so bridging social capital is when we do look at that and connecting to people that are different than we are. And then there's another type that's called identifying social capital, which basically is I work at this job, I'm in accounting, you're over here in community affairs, and we kind of talk to each other and share some information, but we really don't, linking, but we really don't know each other that well. We're just linked because of the situation that we're in. And then there's identifying social capital, which is folks who identify based on race, based on ideology. And again, I don't want to have you believe that there is one that's worse than the other. But the reality is that if we're not intentional and deliberate about building different types of social capital, you will continue to see polarization in this country because we'll continue to connect to what's familiar and what's comfortable for us. And so there's this gentleman by the name of Robert Putnam who I love his work. When he came to Dallas, I became a groupie of his, and I had never been an academic groupie, and that was the first time that ever happened. I love Putnam because in 2010, he wrote a book called Bowling Alone. And in his book, he says some things that are very impactful. He says that communities that have high social capital have higher educational outcomes. Communities that have high social capital, there's lower crime. Communities that have high social capital, people vote. They're civically engaged. Why? Because people feel connected and responsible to one another's outcome. But check this out. Social capital is important because it is about the connection that can help us live longer, that can help us fight disease. There is Blue Zone research that shows that when people who have been over 100 years old, one of the reasons that they have longevity in their lives is because of social connection. And so I want to talk about the role of two inmates, Mumia Abu-Jamal and Bernie Madoff. And what's so interesting is that in both of these men's life, social capital played a role in where they ended up. Mumia Abu-Jamal ended up in a state penitentiary because he did not have parental involvement. He was a teen parent, and Bernie Madoff's social capital allowed him to prey on his own community, and he still ended up in a posh federal prison. So my research on social capital looks at a couple of things. It's called From Bonding to Bridging. And what I did was I brought together a group of women who were from different backgrounds, educational experiences, ages, and I noticed several things when I brought them together. One, it's important that we own our power and our privilege and own that up front because many of us have things that we may not have done but were given to us, and we need to own that. Number two, we need to understand that when we're in these wonderful small, safe spaces, that perception transformation occurs, that we really begin to change the way that we think based on the experience of others. And then the other piece is there's this framework that was created by a group of feminists that's called relational cultural theory that says there are 5 good things to building relationships. And I'll name just a few, but they talk about mutual empathy, and they talk about respect for diversity and zest for life. We need to use those things as frameworks to help people connect better to each other. So why is this important? Because when we don't have proximity to one another, we begin to isolate ourselves and move away from one another. When we don't have presence, we don't show up. And one of the things I would challenge you to do is we have to have more opportunities for cognitive dissonance and disorienting dilemmas. We need these spaces where we're uncomfortable and we're wrestling with the differences when we're together. Instead of retreating, we need to run to these spaces of difference and begin to question, why does it make me uncomfortable? But the other thing that we have to begin to start doing is recognizing that in that uncomfortableness, that there can be 2 realities that exist at the same time. I often tell my daughter that you got to get out of this space of believing that it is either or and begin to understand that it is both and that these multiple realities can exist. And just because someone has an experience very different than yours does not invalidate their experience. And so I want to leave you with this idea of a bridge. I love Oprah, and so hint, hint. And I went to, even though there was nothing under the chairs, I was getting excited. But I want to end with this. I went to her event, and someone made a comment about pictures of bridges. And what they said was, bridges are something that we don't pay attention to because bridges support us. If you notice, there is support that holds the bridge up. If you notice, people are going to and fro on their journey. Ladies and gentlemen, we have to become bridges. We have to be willing to allow people to come to and fro in their life journey and be a part of our experiences. We have to be willing to be supportive of others. We have to be willing to be in proximity to people and show up even when it's uncomfortable. Thank you.